Frank Sinatra called their song the best of the decade. John Lennon played it on repeat and begged to hear it again. Glenn Frey said they were the best singing band in the world. Over 30 million records sold, 13 US top 40 hits, 5 million radio spins. Then, the man who wrote it all was legally banned from using the name he invented on a highway drive. This is the rise and fall of Little River Band. Melbourne, Australia, 1975. While American bands were filling arenas and FM radio was rewriting the rules of rock, a group of seasoned Australian musicians sat down with a shared, audacious ambition to crack the American market. Not just visit it, conquer it. This was not a band of wide-eyed teenagers chasing a dream. These were veterans. Graham Goebel and Bebe Birtles had played together in a folk rock outfit called Mississippi, a band that had already made the difficult journey to London in 1974, only to be met with what the research generously described as an indifferent reception. They came home from England bruised but sharpened, with the hard-won clarity that to reach the world, they needed a frontman of genuine star quality. They found him in Glenn Shorrock, the former lead singer of the Twilights and Axiom, a man with a voice that could carry both tenderness and conviction. Add Derek Pellicci on drums, and the nucleus of something special was in place. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Bebe Birtles brought his own distinguished history. He had been the bass player in Zoot, a band that also launched the career of a young Rick Springfield. These were musicians who understood the machinery of the industry. They weren't naive, and they moved with a purpose that set them apart from the start. Rounding out the early classic lineup were guitarist Rick Formosa and bass player Roger McLaughlin, along with manager Glenn Wheatley, himself the former musician for the Masters Apprentices. A man who understood exactly what the American market demanded and was determined to deliver it. The name came almost by accident. During a drive toward a performance just south of Melbourne, the band passed the exit sign for the small township of Little River on the Prince's Highway. Glenn Shorrock first suggested it as a song title, then as a band name. It stuck. Their debut album arrived in November 1975. The centerpiece was It's a Long Way There, an 8-minute harmonic epic that signaled exactly who these men were and what they intended to become.
It's a long way to where I'm going.
The song hit the Australian top 20 and caught the attention of American radio scouts who were hungry for something new. The dream was already becoming real. To understand what Little River Band accomplished in the American market, you have to understand the landscape they entered. By the mid-1970s, FM radio had transformed rock culture. Album-oriented stations now had the freedom to play longer tracks, deeper cuts, richer arrangements. The tight 3-minute single was no longer the only currency. Sophisticated musicianship was being rewarded, and an audience of millions was hungry for harmony-driven rock that felt polished, emotional, and real. Little River Band fit that landscape perfectly. Their entry into America was no accident. Manager Glenn Wheatley understood that the path to the American market ran through relentless touring and strategic label placement. The band signed with a label, and in 1977, the US version of their album Diamantina Cocktail was released, a curated collection drawn from their earlier Australian recordings that showcased the full warmth and depth of their sound. The first major American signal came with the single It's a Long Way There, which reached number 28 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1976. It was a remarkable achievement for any international artist, let alone an Australian band that most American listeners had never heard of. But the real breakthrough arrived with Help Is On Its Way, written by Glenn Shorrock. With its upbeat tempo and cascading harmonies, the song climbed to number 14 on the Billboard Hot 100. Back home in Australia, it reached number 1. For American listeners hearing it for the first time on their FM stations, there was nothing about it that said foreign. It simply sounded like great music. Happy Anniversary followed, reaching number 16. By January 1978, they had earned gold certification, the first Australian band in history to achieve it in the United States. The emotional hook of this period was the Cinderella story quality of it all. These were musicians from the other side of the world, fitting seamlessly alongside Fleetwood Mac and the Doobie Brothers on American radio. Nobody was calling them that Australian band. They were simply one of the finest harmony rock groups on the airwaves. The stage was set. The biggest chapter of their story was about to begin. Between 1978 and 1981, Little River Band became something extraordinary, one of the most consistent hit-making forces in all of American popular music. They achieved a run that few bands matched at the time, a top 10 single in the United States for 6 consecutive years. Not 6 hits. 6 consecutive years of top 10 hits. That kind of sustained excellence was the product of extraordinary songwriting, flawless vocal chemistry, and a relentless commitment to their craft. The Eagles' Glenn Frey, himself no stranger to harmonic perfection, reportedly called them the best singing band in the world. For the men and women tuning into FM radio across America during this era, that assessment felt exactly right. It began with Reminiscing in 1978. Written by Graham Goebel in approximately 30 minutes after lead guitarist David Briggs showed him a C9 chord, the song had a jazz-tinged sophistication that was unlike virtually anything else on pop radio at the time. Goebel took that single chord and built something timeless. Glenn Shorrock's vocal delivery was warm, unhurried, and deeply felt. The voice of a man who had genuinely lived the emotions he was singing about.
That's the way it began. We were hand in hand when Miller's band.
The song reached number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100. It has since been played on American radio over 5 million times. John Lennon, during his famous Lost Weekend period with May Pang in Los Angeles, reportedly asked her to play Reminiscing again and again. Frank Sinatra, a man who had heard virtually every great song of the 20th century, reportedly called it the best song of the 1970s. Lady followed Reminiscing, climbing to number 10. 2 classics from the same album. The band's album Sleeper Catcher reached number 16 on the Billboard 200 and was certified platinum. Then came First Under the Wire in 1979, one of their highest charting albums in America, reaching number 10 on the Billboard 200. It delivered 2 more top 10 hits. Lonesome Loser reached number 6, with its undercurrent of quiet desperation that resonated deeply with a generation navigating the complicated emotional terrain of adulthood. And Cool Change, written by Shorrock, climbed to number 10 on its own. Cool Change was something special. Its lush, shimmering production and Shorrock's soulful lead vocal captured a feeling of personal reflection and environmental wonder that felt genuinely rare in commercial rock. The song was later named one of the 30 best Australian songs ever written. These weren't just chart positions. For the audience who heard these songs on late-night radio in 1978, 1979, 1980, these songs were the soundtrack to something real. They triggered memories that still surface decades later with startling clarity. Arena tours followed, sold-out shows across America. The band that had formed from the ashes of Mississippi and crossed the Pacific with a dream was now headlining stages that most Australian musicians could only imagine. But the higher you climb, the more clearly you can see the cracks forming beneath you. By 1981, Little River Band stood at what appeared to be the apex of their power. They accepted an invitation that confirmed their status as genuine rock royalty. They traveled to the West Indies to record their 6th studio album, Time Exposure, with Sir George Martin, the legendary producer who had shaped the sound of the Beatles. Recording with George Martin on a tropical island should have been a triumph. In many ways, it was. But it was also the moment when the first serious fracture in the band's internal chemistry became undeniable. Martin recognized something in the voice of Wayne Nelson, the American bass player who had joined the band in 1980, that he felt suited the early 1980s radio landscape. That freshness, as Martin described it, led him to place Nelson on lead vocals for 2 of the album's biggest tracks, The Night Owls and Take It Easy on Me.
There's a heart of a night owl calling.
Both songs became top 10 hits in the United States. From a commercial standpoint, the decision was sound. But for Glenn Shorrock, the founding voice whose vocal identity was woven into every classic hit the band had produced, being marginalized by an outside producer on his own band's album was a wound that didn't heal quietly. Time Exposure may have delivered chart success, but it signaled something darker, The band's identity was beginning to shift away from the voices that had built it. The tensions inside the group had been building for years. The relentless schedule, recording an album per year while touring the globe, was exhausting. Different members held different visions for the band's future sound. Shorrock, weary of the heavy touring schedule and the heated internal arguments, expressed his desire for time off to explore solo material. The rest of the band, led by Graham Goebel, saw this not as a reasonable request, but as a moment of departure. In 1982, in a decision that shocked the Australian music world, the founding members voted to replace Glenn Shorrock, the man whose voice had carried Reminiscing, Cool Change, and Lady to millions of listeners who had never even known his name. Shorrock later reflected on the experience with quiet devastation. "It didn't go down well with me. I didn't expect to be replaced." The man who had suggested the band's name from a highway sign in Victoria was now out of the band he had helped build from nothing. To replace Shorrock, the band turned to John Farnham, a decision that made perfect sense on paper. Farnham was one of Australia's most celebrated vocalists, a man with a 4-octave range and undeniable stage presence. Manager Glenn Wheatley, who handled both Farnham and Little River Band, saw it as a natural fit. On a technical level, Farnham delivered. His first single with the band, The Other Guy, reached number 11 in the United States in 1982. The machinery was still running, but the machinery was running on different fuel. Graham Goebel's evolving creative vision pushed the band toward a harder, more progressive sound. A deliberate pivot away from the warm, melodic identity that had defined their peak years. For longtime fans, something felt different. The harmonies were still there, but the emotional geography had shifted. The internal chemistry that Farnham had been recruited to restore never fully materialized. And one by one, the founding members began to exit. Beeb Birtles left in 1983, dissatisfied with the harder musical direction the band was taking. Drummer Derek Pellicci followed in 1984 for similar reasons. The band even shortened its name to simply LRB for a period, as if distancing itself from the very identity it had spent a decade building. Their album, Playing to Win in 1985, peaked at number 75 in the US, a long fall from the heights of First Under the Wire. By 1986, John Farnham departed to record his solo masterpiece, Whispering Jack, which became one of the best-selling albums in Australian history. He had lent his voice to a transitional chapter of the band's story, but the original Little River Band, the collective that would ultimately rack up 13 US top 40 hits and over 30 million records sold, was effectively gone. What followed was the strangest chapter yet. In 1987, their record label wanted the classic voice back. Glenn Shorrock and Derek Pellicci returned to the fold, and a new business structure was put in place. A holding company was established, and the then current members, including Graham Goebel, Stephen Housden, Wayne Nelson, Pellicci, and Shorrock, were involved as directors of the company. The agreement contained a clause that seemed bureaucratic at the time, but would prove devastating in hindsight. If a member left or was fired, their shares and rights to the Little River Band trademark would remain with the band. Nobody imagined in that moment how that single clause would eventually rewrite the entire history of the band. Throughout the 1990s, the founding members departed one by one, and with each departure, they effectively surrendered their stake in the name that had once been theirs. Graham Goebel, the man who wrote Reminiscing in 30 Minutes and whose harmonic arrangements had defined the band's golden era, left in 1992. Glenn Shorrock, returning for one final chapter, walked away for the last time in 1996, accepting what was described as a handsome buyout. By 1998, Derek Pellicci was gone too. With his departure, not a single member from the original 1975 lineup remained. What was left was Stephen Housden, a guitarist who had joined the band in 1981, and Wayne Nelson, the American bass player who had come aboard in 1980. Because Housden was the last remaining director of their holding company, he became the sole legal owner of the Little River Band, trademark logos, and business name. The founding members realized too late what they had signed away. In 2002, Glenn Shorrock, Beeb Birtles, and Graham Goebel attempted to reunite under the names The Voices of Little River Band, and the original Little River Band. Housden immediately filed for a legal injunction. The case went before the Federal Court of Australia. The case ended with court orders that barred them from using Little River Band as part of their band name, limiting it to descriptive use only in promotion. They eventually performed together as Bertels Shorik Gobel, or simply BSG, but the legal restrictions made it nearly impossible for them to market themselves to the American audience that knew only the Little River Band brand. The tension reached its most surreal point in 2015, when the touring version of Little River Band, featuring Wayne Nelson and 4 American musicians with no connection to the band's original era, was booked for The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon to celebrate their 40th anniversary. The backlash from the original members was immediate and fierce. Glenn Shorik instructed his publishing company to deny the current lineup permission to perform his songs, including Reminiscing and Lady, on the broadcast. After the backlash and licensing standoff, The Tonight Show canceled the appearance. The men who had written those songs, recorded those songs, and carried those harmonies across American radio for a decade were now legally strangers to the name they had built. It was a kind of institutional amnesia that cut to the bone. And yet, the songs remained. Despite the litigation, despite the lineup changes, despite the decades of legal warfare over a name chosen from a highway sign, Reminiscing still played on classic rock radio. Cool Change still moved people. Lady still triggered something deep and immediate in anyone who had heard it on a summer night in 1978. Graham Goebel once reflected with some bitterness that they had always been a faceless band, that nobody in America really knew who the individual members were. But that facelessness, that quality of letting the music speak entirely for itself, turned out to be both their greatest vulnerability and their most enduring gift. The music transcended the makers. The songs outlived the band. The yacht rock revival of recent years brought a new generation of listeners to their catalog. Younger ears discovering Reminiscing and Lady and feeling what their parents felt 45 years ago. Radio play, film placements, streaming playlists built around the soft rock aesthetic of the 1970s. All of it kept the music alive and circulating. Songs crafted with patience and care in Australian studios found new homes in the ears of people who hadn't even been born when they were recorded. In the end, the Little River Band story is about more than lineup changes and trademark disputes. It's about what happens when the thing you created becomes bigger than you, when the art takes on a life entirely its own, and the artists who made it are left standing on the outside looking in. The harmonies are still there. They always will be. Little River Band proved that great music needs no passport. 3-part harmonies from Melbourne, Australia, conquered American radio and left behind songs that still move people more than 4 decades later. But their story also carried a warning that the machine of success can turn on the very people who built it. The voices are gone. The name lives on. Which Little River Band song still takes you back to the 1970s? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more of rock's greatest stories.